The morning air in the Volkswagen works at Fallersleben carried the sharp smell of welding flux and machine oil. It was September of 1939, 3 weeks after German forces crossed into Poland, and the engineers gathered in the main testing facility were examining something that had arrived via diplomatic pouch from the German embassy in Washington. Spread across the work table were American automotive trade journals, technical specifications, and grainy photographs of a vehicle prototype that the United States Army Quartermaster Corps had commissioned from 3 separate manufacturers. The Americans were calling it a reconnaissance car. The German engineers called it something else, a joke. Ferdinand Porsche himself picked up one of the specification sheets and read aloud to his colleagues. Maximum weight, 1,500 pounds. Wheelbase 80 inches, 4-wheel drive, capable of climbing a 60% grade. The men around the table exchanged glances. One of them, an engineer named Franz Reimspeiss, who had spent 6 years perfecting the Kubelwagen's suspension geometry, actually laughed. He pointed to the gross vehicle weight specification, 1,113 kilograms with crew and equipment. Then he gestured toward their own Kubelwagen prototype sitting in the corner of the facility. 725 kilograms empty, built to carry 4 men over any terrain the Wehrmacht would encounter. Simple, efficient, proven. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The American vehicle, Reimspeiss concluded, violated basic engineering principles. 4-wheel drive added weight and complexity. The specifications called for a 60-horsepower engine in a vehicle that would weigh barely more than a motorcycle with sidecars. The power-to-weight ratio suggested the Americans were building a racing car, not a military vehicle. And the timeline was absurd. The Army wanted delivery of 70 prototype vehicles within 49 days. German military vehicle development typically took 18 months from concept to prototype. The Americans, these engineers concluded, were engaging in typical American excess, throwing money and horsepower at problems that German engineering had already solved with elegant simplicity. The Kubelwagen used a rear-mounted, air-cooled engine adapted from the Volkswagen civilian car. 23.5 horsepower was sufficient because the vehicle was light. 2-wheel drive was sufficient because the long wheelbase and rear engine weight distribution provided excellent traction. Simplicity meant reliability. This was the German way. What those engineers could not have known, sitting in their facility in September of 1939, was that they were witnessing the opening chapter of a story that would end with American Jeeps outnumbering all German light vehicles combined by a factor that would seem impossible to believe. They could not have known that within 5 years, German soldiers would covet captured Jeeps above any other piece of American equipment. They could not have known that the joke they were laughing at in 1939 would become the vehicle that German generals would later call the most effective light military machine they had ever encountered. The vehicle they were dismissing was born from a specification that reflected a fundamentally different military philosophy. In July of 1940, the United States Army issued a requirement that had been developed by Captain Robert Howie of the Infantry Board and Major Robert McBride of the Cavalry Board. The Army needed a light reconnaissance vehicle that could replace motorcycles and the obsolete Ford Model T trucks still in service. The specification was precise. The vehicle must weigh no more than 1,590 pounds. It must have 4-wheel drive. It must have a wheelbase of no more than 75 inches, later increased to 80 inches. It must be capable of carrying a crew of 3 plus a radio and weapons. It must ford water 18 inches deep. It must climb a 60% grade. And, most importantly, it must be deliverable in massive quantities immediately. 3 companies responded. American Bantam Car Company submitted their prototype first. Ford Motor Company and Willys Overland followed. The Army tested all three designs in conditions that would have horrified German engineers focused on careful, methodical development. They drove the vehicles through mud, sand, and snow. They loaded them with twice their rated capacity. They ran them at maximum speed until components failed. They drove them off, loading ramps to test suspension strength. The Willys design, powered by a four-cylinder engine they called the Go Devil, emerged as the winner. It produced 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. The engine was simple, a flathead design, with L-shaped combustion chambers that sacrificed efficiency for durability and ease of manufacture. Every component was overbuilt. The frame was heavy-gauge steel. The transfer case was designed to handle twice the rated torque. The suspension could absorb impacts that would destroy a normal vehicle. In November of 1941, the Army placed an order for 16,000 Willys MB vehicles. This was before Pearl Harbor, before America entered the war. By the time the first Jeep rolled off the Willys production line in 1941, Germany had already conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, and Greece. German forces were at the gates of Moscow. The German military vehicle fleet consisted primarily of Opel Blitz trucks, various half-tracks, Kubelwagens, and motorcycles with sidecars. German intelligence officers compiled detailed assessments of foreign military equipment. These reports went into files that were studied by the Waffenamt, the German Army Weapons Agency. The reports on American military vehicles noted large-scale production capacity, but concluded that American vehicles prioritized comfort and mechanical complexity over battlefield utility. German vehicles, the report stated, were superior in fuel efficiency and maintainability under field conditions. This assessment was not entirely wrong. The Kubelwagen did achieve better fuel economy, 17 kilometers per litre compared to the Jeep's approximately 8 kilometers per litre. The air-cooled engine did eliminate the radiator, removing a vulnerable component. The vehicle's light weight did make it easier for crews to extract from mud or sand when stuck, and the simple rear-wheel drive system did mean fewer components to maintain. But these advantages were built on assumptions about warfare that were already becoming obsolete. The Kubelwagen was designed for a military that expected short, decisive campaigns. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Get in, win fast, get out. Fuel efficiency mattered because Germany imported petroleum. Simplicity mattered because German industry prioritized quality over quantity. Lightweight mattered because German tactical doctrine emphasized speed and maneuver over brute force. The Jeep was designed for a different kind of war. A long war. A global war. A war of industrial attrition where victory would go to the nation that could build more equipment, faster, and keep it running under any conditions. The Jeep's four-wheel drive system used a Spicer transfer case with high and low range. This meant the vehicle could operate in conditions where two-wheel drive vehicles simply stopped. Deep mud, loose sand, steep grades, snow, ice. The Jeep kept moving. The 60-horsepower engine meant the vehicle could tow a 1,000-pound trailer or a 37mm anti-tank gun. The Kubelwagen could not. The Jeep's ground clearance of 8 3/4 inches meant it could traverse obstacles that would high-center a Kubelwagen. The suspension travel meant it could absorb impacts at speed without braking. Most importantly, the Jeep was designed to be built in quantities that would make individual vehicle performance almost irrelevant. Between 1941 and 1945, Willys produced 363,958 Jeeps. Ford, building to identical specifications under license, produced 277,896. Total production 641,854 vehicles. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The unit cost was $649. This was less than the cost of a single Kubelwagen when production scale was factored in. Germany produced 50,435 Kubelwagens during the entire war. The Germans built approximately one Kubelwagen for every 12.5 Jeeps produced. The first encounter between German forces and American Jeeps occurred in North Africa. British forces had been receiving Jeeps through Lend-Lease since 1941. When American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in November of 1942 as part of Operation Torch, they brought Jeeps with them in numbers that immediately caught German attention. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, fighting British and Commonwealth forces since 1941, had experience with various Allied vehicles. They had captured British trucks, scout cars, and armoured vehicles. They had seen the Valentine tanks and Matilda tanks. They had fought against the formidable British 25-pounder field guns. But the Jeep was something different. German reconnaissance units in Tunisia began reporting encounters with American vehicle columns in January of 1943. The reports noted that American units appeared to have light four-wheeled vehicles in extraordinary numbers. These vehicles moved independently across terrain that should have required tracked vehicles. They appeared in places where conventional military logic said light vehicles could not operate. A German intelligence summary from February of 1943, compiled by the 5th Panzer Army headquarters, described captured American Jeeps in detail. The report noted the four-wheel drive system, the transfer case with high and low range, the simple but rugged construction, and the ease of maintenance. The report concluded that the American Jeep was superior to the Kubelwagen in cross-country mobility, towing capacity, and load-carrying capability. The only area where the Kubelwagen maintained an advantage was fuel consumption. But in North Africa, in 1943, fuel consumption was rapidly becoming irrelevant. German forces were being strangled by Allied air and naval attacks on Mediterranean shipping. The Afrika Korps was running out of everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies, and most critically, fuel. By March of 1943, German units were capturing and using any Allied vehicles they could acquire. British trucks were repainted with German markings. Captured American Jeeps were especially prized. German officers used them for command vehicles. Forward observers used them to reach observation posts. Reconnaissance units used them because they could go places the Kubelwagen could not. German soldiers gave the Jeep a nickname, Wunderwagen. Wunderwagen. This was not affection. It was grudging respect mixed with frustration. The vehicle represented something the German military was beginning to understand with growing dread. The Americans had resources on a scale that made German technical superiority meaningless. The end came quickly in Tunisia. On May 7, 1943, British armoured units entered Tunis. American forces captured Bizerte the same day. German forces throughout Tunisia began surrendering in groups ranging from individual squads to entire battalions. Over the next 6 days, 267,000 Axis troops laid down their arms. Among the equipment German soldiers observed during those final chaotic days were American Jeeps in numbers that seemed impossible. For every German vehicle on Tunisian roads, there appeared to be 10 American machines, moving supplies, towing guns, carrying commanders, evacuating wounded, performing every light vehicle task simultaneously across hundreds of square kilometers. After the surrender, United States Army historians interviewed captured German officers. The interviews were conducted by historians like Hugh Cole, who would later write the official histories of the Mediterranean campaigns. The German officers were asked to assess American equipment and tactics. Their answers were remarkably consistent. General Lieutenant Fritz Krauss, who had commanded German forces in the final defense of Tunis, stated that he admired the American Jeep more than any other piece of American equipment. Not the Sherman tanks, though they were numerous. Not the artillery, though it fired more shells than German forces could imagine having. Not the aircraft, though they owned the sky. The Jeep. When asked why, Krause explained that the Jeep represented something more fundamental than firepower or armor. It represented a different philosophy of war. The Americans had created a universal vehicle that could perform 10 different roles adequately well. The Germans had created specialized vehicles that could each perform one role perfectly, but specialized vehicles were useful only when you had enough of each type. When you ran out of reconnaissance vehicles, you could not substitute a truck. When you ran out of trucks, you could not use a Kubelwagen to haul heavy loads. The Jeep solved this problem through brute mechanical capability. One vehicle type in overwhelming numbers, capable of adapting to any light vehicle mission. This was the American way, not elegant, not efficient by German standards, but devastatingly effective in practice. The pattern established in North Africa repeated with intensifying clarity in every subsequent campaign. Italy, beginning in September of 1943, provided terrain that German engineers had assumed would vindicate their design philosophy. The Italian peninsula offered mountains, narrow roads, mud in winter, dust in summer, and limited maneuver space, conditions where light, weight, and fuel efficiency should have mattered more than raw power. The opposite proved true. American forces advancing up the Italian boot brought jeeps in proportions that shocked German defenders. The mountainous terrain that should have limited vehicle mobility became navigable because the jeep's four-wheel drive and low-range gearing allowed it to climb grades that stopped the Kubelwagen cold. The narrow roads and limited supply routes that should have created logistical bottlenecks were managed because jeeps could move supplies forward in continuous small loads rather than requiring large truck convoys. German defensive positions in the mountains of Italy were carefully chosen to exploit terrain. Observation posts on high ground overlooked approach routes. Artillery positions were placed to cover likely avenues of advance. Infantry strongpoints were positioned to force attackers into killing zones. These positions worked against forces that moved predictably, that telegraphed their movements, that required time to coordinate and concentrate. American forces used jeeps to bypass German assumptions. Forward observers reached positions that German planners had considered inaccessible to vehicle traffic. Company and battalion commanders moved between positions in minutes rather than hours, allowing them to respond to tactical developments faster than German forces could react. Artillery spotters equipped with radios in jeeps could observe from multiple positions, calling fire missions that arrived with speed and accuracy that disrupted German defensive coordination. A German after-action report from the fighting around Monte Cassino in early 1944 noted American tactical flexibility that appeared to violate normal military limitations. American units responded to German movements with a speed that suggested either supernatural intelligence or communications capabilities far beyond German norms. The report's author, an intelligence officer with the 14th Panzer Corps, concluded that American radio-equipped light vehicles allowed their commanders to maintain situational awareness that German commanders could only achieve when stationary in established command posts. This observation touched on something fundamental. The Jeep was not just a vehicle, it was a mobile communications platform. Every Jeep could carry a radio. The SCR 510 or SCR 610 radio sets fit easily in the rear cargo area. This meant American platoon leaders, company commanders, forward observers, and reconnaissance teams were all connected by voice communication while moving. They could coordinate, call for support, report enemy positions, and receive new orders without stopping. German tactical communications relied heavily on motorcycle couriers and landline telephones. Radio sets existed but were heavier, less reliable, and allocated primarily to higher headquarters. A German company commander in Italy who wanted to coordinate with his battalion headquarters typically sent a runner or used a field telephone if wire had been laid. An American company commander in Italy picked up his radio handset and spoke directly to his battalion commander, his supporting artillery, and his adjacent units while moving in his jeep. The cumulative effect of this disparity was an operational tempo that German forces could not match. American attacks developed faster. American responses to German counterattacks came sooner. American exploitation of tactical success happened immediately rather than after the careful preparation German doctrine required. By the time Allied forces broke out of the Anzio beachhead in May of 1944 and entered Rome in June, German intelligence officers had compiled extensive reports on captured American equipment. The Jeep featured prominently in these assessments. Every report reached the same conclusion. The vehicle was individually superior to German equivalents in every category except fuel consumption, and it existed in numbers that made capture and use of individual vehicles tactically insignificant. Then came Normandy. The invasion of France in June of 1944 brought the full weight of American industrial production to bear on the German military in a way that shattered every remaining assumption about the balance of forces. The invasion fleet itself carried more jeeps than the entire German army in the West possessed light vehicles of all types. The initial assault waves brought jeeps ashore in waterproofed configurations, driving through several feet of water to reach the beaches. Within 48 hours of the initial landings, thousands of jeeps were operating throughout the Normandy beachhead. German commanders, observing the build-up from their defensive positions, reported vehicle densities that seemed impossible. American infantry regiments, they noted, appeared to have organic transportation for every function. Each battalion had jeeps for the commander, the executive officer, the operations officer, the intelligence officer, the communications section, the medical section, the reconnaissance platoon, and the forward observers from supporting artillery. Each company had jeeps for the company commander and the weapons platoon. Each artillery battery had jeeps for the forward observers, the communications section, and the survey crew. A German infantry battalion in Normandy had perhaps 3 or 4 Kubelwagens, if it was fortunate. Most had fewer. Motorcycle combinations supplemented light vehicle transportation, but motorcycles were vulnerable to small arms fire and useless in heavy mud. The typical German infantry battalion moved primarily on foot, with supplies and heavy weapons transported by horse-drawn wagons. An American infantry battalion had approximately 30 jeeps. Every key leader was mobile. Every critical function had dedicated transportation. The firepower, command and control, and logistics of the American battalion could move and reposition independently, without waiting for a cumbersome vehicle column or a lengthy foot march. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The hedgerow country of Normandy presented terrain that should have negated American mobility advantages. The ancient Norman bocage consisted of small fields surrounded by thick hedgerows, earth, berms planted with trees and bushes that formed natural obstacles 5 to 10 feet high. Roads were narrow, sunken lanes that channeled movement. Visibility was limited to a few dozen meters. It was defenders' terrain, and the Germans defended it with skill and determination. But the Jeep's capability allowed American forces to adapt. Engineers modified Jeeps with hedgerow cutting devices, steel tusks welded to the front bumpers that could tear through the earth berms. Commanders used jeeps to move rapidly between positions along the narrow lanes, maintaining control of dispersed units. Forward observers positioned jeeps in concealed locations with clear views of German positions, calling down artillery fire with a speed and accuracy that German forces could not escape. The breakthrough came in late July of 1944 with Operation Cobra. American forces concentrated overwhelming combat power on a narrow front, then exploited the gap with armored divisions that drove deep into the German rear. The exploitation phase relied on speed and logistics. Armored columns raced forward, bypassing German strongpoints, cutting supply lines, and creating chaos in the German rear areas. Those armored columns were supported by jeeps in numbers that allowed American commanders to maintain control despite the rapid advance. Reconnaissance jeeps scouted routes ahead of the armored columns. Communications. Jeeps maintained radio links between advancing units and headquarters. Supply jeeps brought forward ammunition and fuel. Liaison jeeps carried orders and reports. Maintenance jeeps brought spare parts and mechanics to repair damaged vehicles. The speed of the American advance after Cobra exceeded anything seen in the European war to that point. Patton's Third Army, unleashed in early August, advanced hundreds of kilometers in days. German forces attempting to establish new defensive lines found American units already in their rear before the positions could be properly organized. German after-action reports from August and September of 1944 consistently described American mobility as the decisive factor in tactical defeats. A report from the 7th Army headquarters, written by Generaloberst Paul Hauser after he escaped the Falaise pocket, stated that German forces could not establish coherent defensive lines because American mobile forces consistently appeared in unexpected locations faster than German intelligence could track them. The problem, Hauser explained, was not that German troops fought poorly or that German officers made poor tactical decisions. The problem was that American forces operated inside the German decision cycle. By the time German commanders recognized a threat and organized a response, American forces had already moved to a new position or accomplished their objective. This operational advantage stemmed directly from American logistics and mobility. The Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy system that supplied Allied forces advancing across France, is well documented. Less discussed, but equally important, were the thousands of jeeps that formed the fine capillaries of the American supply system, moving small loads continuously, evacuating wounded, transporting commanders, carrying orders, and performing the countless small logistical tasks that kept units combat effective. A German quartermaster's report from September of 1944, captured after the war, compared German and American logistics in stark terms. German supply doctrine, the report explained, was based on calculated sufficiency. Planners determined the minimum supplies needed for an operation and delivered them with maximum efficiency. American supply doctrine, by contrast, appeared to be based on overwhelming abundance. American planners seemed to assume that every unit would need more supplies than calculated requirements suggested, and they delivered those supplies with redundancy that German logistics could never match. The report included observations from German officers who had inspected captured American supply dumps. The descriptions read like catalogues of impossible wealth. Mountains of artillery shells stacked in the open, uncovered, apparently unlimited. Acres of spare parts for vehicles, tires, engines, transmissions, all standardized and interchangeable. Fuel dumps containing thousands of jerrycans, far more than immediate tactical needs required. Food supplies so abundant that American soldiers discarded rations that German soldiers would have carefully preserved. The jeeps themselves were treated as semi-disposable items. German officers reported observing American units abandoning jeeps with minor mechanical problems rather than repairing them. A vehicle with a damaged transmission might be pushed to the roadside and left. A jeep with a thrown rod or damaged differential would be stripped of valuable components like radios and machine guns, then abandoned. The bureaucratic effort to recover, repair, and redeploy a $649 vehicle was less than the effort to simply requisition a replacement. This wastefulness shocked German observers, whose military operated under conditions of severe scarcity. Every German vehicle was tracked in detailed inventories. Every vehicle was maintained as long as parts and labor allowed. Abandoning a functional or repairable vehicle was unthinkable. Yet the Americans did so routinely because they had so many vehicles that individual losses were statistically irrelevant. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 provided the final, definitive proof that German tactical excellence could not overcome American material superiority. SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, one of Hitler's most capable special operations commanders, was tasked with Operation Grief, the infiltration mission designed to support the Ardennes offensive. Skorzeny's plan required captured American vehicles, particularly jeeps, to be used by German soldiers in American uniforms operating behind American lines. The goal was to seize bridges over the Meuse River, spread confusion, cut communications, and disrupt American response to the German attack. The operation required 100 captured American jeeps. Despite 18 months of systematic efforts to acquire intact American vehicles, despite standing orders throughout the German military to capture and preserve American equipment, despite dedicated teams assigned to recover abandoned vehicles from battlefields, Skorzeny received approximately 30 jeeps. This number, 30 operational captured jeeps from the entire German military establishment in Western Europe, told the story of the war more clearly than any battle report. American jeeps were everywhere on the battlefield. They were the most common American vehicle German soldiers encountered. Yet despite constant exposure to thousands of American jeeps, the Germans could not accumulate even 100 intact functional examples. American units disabled vehicles before abandoning them. Distributor caps were removed, fuel was drained, engine blocks were destroyed, and American soldiers, aware that Germans prized captured jeeps, developed informal but effective booby traps. A fragmentation grenade with the pin pulled and the spoon held down by the driver's seat cushion killed several German soldiers before the tactic became widely known. Even when captured intact, keeping jeeps operational proved difficult. The 60-horsepower engine consumed fuel at rates German logistics could not sustain. German fuel, increasingly adulterated with synthetic additives, fouled American carburetors. Spare parts were non-existent. Maintaining captured jeeps required cannibalizing other captured jeeps, which rapidly reduced the number of operational vehicles. Skorzeny launched Operation Greif anyway with the inadequate resources available. The operation achieved brief tactical success. German teams in American uniforms, driving captured jeeps, successfully infiltrated American lines, changed road signs, cut telephone cables, and gathered intelligence. But the fundamental flaw became apparent within 48 hours. There were so many actual American jeeps on the roads that German imposters initially blended into normal traffic. However, American counterintelligence identified suspicious patterns. Skorzeny had assumed American jeeps normally carried 4 soldiers, because German vehicles normally carried 4 soldiers. In fact, American practice was to assign 2 or occasionally 3 men per jeep. 4 occupants was unusual. Once this pattern was identified, every jeep with 4 occupants became suspect. Multiple German teams were captured because of this detail. Within 72 hours, American forces throughout the Ardennes were stopping jeeps and questioning occupants about American culture, slang, and current events. The paranoia spread beyond actual threats, with American soldiers sometimes shooting at other Americans who gave incorrect answers to impromptu questions. 3 members of Skorzény's teams, captured near Iwil, Belgium, on December 17th, were tried by military court-martial and executed by firing squad on December 23rd. Skorzeny himself was wounded and evacuated. Panzer Brigade 150 was committed as a conventional combat unit and suffered heavy casualties. The operation achieved none of its objectives. The failure of Operation Graif highlighted the central problem. American logistics were so overwhelming that even successful infiltration was meaningless. 30 captured jeeps were insignificant compared to thousands of actual American jeeps operating in the same area. German imposters were drops of ink in an ocean of genuine American vehicles. The Battle of the Bulge itself, despite initial German success, ultimately proved the same point. Germany committed its last operational reserves, achieving tactical surprise and creating a dangerous salient in American lines. But American forces responded with a speed and strength that German planners had considered impossible. Entire armies reoriented and counterattacked within days. Patton's Third Army, 90 miles south and facing a different direction, turned 90 degrees and attacked north, arriving in 48 hours to relieve Bastogne. This operational mobility, this ability to redirect entire armies across winter roads in a matter of days, was possible only because American units were fully motorized. Every soldier rode in a vehicle. Every unit had organic transportation. The jeeps, the 2.5-ton trucks, the half-tracks, the entire vast fleet of American vehicles allowed American commanders to think and act at a speed German commanders could not match. When the Bulge collapsed in January of 1945, Germany had expended its last strategic reserves for no meaningful gain. The elite panzer divisions committed to the offensive were destroyed. The fuel consumed in the operation could not be replaced. The vehicles lost were gone forever. American losses were replaced within weeks from the endless industrial pipeline stretching back to Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles. After Germany's surrender in May of 1945, Allied occupation forces conducted systematic surveys of German military facilities, factories, and storage depots. Among the discoveries were thousands of captured Allied vehicles scattered throughout what remained of the Third Reich. British trucks, American half-tracks, and jeeps, many repainted with German markings, some modified with armor plating or weapon mounts, were found in various states of repair. The most revealing discovery was not the captured vehicles themselves, but the documentation surrounding them. In the ruins of the Volkswagen factory at Fallersleben, American investigators found engineering drawings and test reports for a project designated Type 82E. The E stood for Einheitsfahrgestell, Unified Chassis. It was a 4-wheel drive version of the Kubelwagen, developed in late 1944 in a desperate attempt to create a German vehicle that could match the Jeep's capability. The Type 82E prototypes used Kubelwagen body components combined with a more powerful engine and a 4-wheel drive system, clearly influenced by captured American examples. Test reports indicated the vehicles performed well. They demonstrated improved cross-country mobility compared to the standard Kubelwagen. They could climb steeper grades and traverse rougher terrain. The test drivers noted that the vehicle finally gave German forces a light reconnaissance platform comparable to the American Jeep. But by the time the prototypes were completed in early 1945, Germany no longer possessed the industrial capacity to produce them in any meaningful numbers. The Volkswagen factory was operating at a fraction of its normal capacity, constantly disrupted by Allied bombing raids. Raw materials were scarce. Skilled workers had been conscripted into the military or killed. The transportation network that would have distributed completed vehicles to military units had been destroyed. The Type 82E program was abandoned when American forces overran the factory in April of 1945. The prototypes were captured and studied by American engineers. A technical intelligence report filed in June of 1945 concluded that the German vehicle demonstrated competent engineering but offered no advantages over the existing American Jeep design. The report recommended no further action. This epitomized the fundamental asymmetry. By the time German engineers recognized the Jeep's superiority and developed a comparable vehicle, the war was already lost. The industrial foundation that could have produced such a vehicle in meaningful quantities had been systematically destroyed by the very forces the vehicle was intended to fight. The engineering philosophy embedded in the Jeep's design had implications that extended far beyond the vehicle itself. German military doctrine had optimized for efficiency and specialization. Each vehicle type was designed for a specific role. The Kubelwagen for reconnaissance and liaison, the Opel Blitz for cargo transport, the half-track for troop movement, the motorcycle combination for courier and light reconnaissance. This approach made sense in a military operating with limited resources and short timelines. American military doctrine, by contrast, optimized for redundancy and versatility. The Jeep could perform reconnaissance, liaison, cargo transport, weapons carriage, ambulance service, communications platform, command and control, and a dozen other roles with varying degrees of effectiveness. It was not the best vehicle for any single mission, but it was adequate for almost every mission, and it existed in such overwhelming numbers that specialization became unnecessary. This philosophical difference reflected deeper truths about the two nations. Germany was a medium-sized European power with a strong industrial base but limited raw materials and energy resources. German success in the early war years came from efficient use of limited resources combined with tactical and operational excellence. When campaigns lasted weeks or months, efficiency was decisive. A smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicle made sense. America was a continental power with vast raw materials, enormous energy resources, and an industrial capacity that dwarfed all other nations combined. American success came from overwhelming material abundance combined with adequate tactical competence. When campaigns lasted years and spanned continents, abundance was decisive. A more capable vehicle, available in unlimited quantities, made sense, even if individual vehicles consumed more resources. The Jeep was the physical manifestation of American industrial power applied to military problems. It was not elegant. It was not particularly sophisticated. German engineers examining captured Jeeps found no revolutionary technologies. The four-wheel drive system used commercially available components. The engine was a simple flathead design. The transmission was conventional. The suspension was rugged but not innovative. What made the Jeep revolutionary was not any single component, but the integration of those components into a vehicle designed for mass production at a scale that made individual vehicle cost and longevity almost irrelevant. American planners assumed vehicles would be damaged, destroyed, or worn out. They designed supply chains to replace vehicles as consumable items. German planners assumed vehicles would be carefully maintained and preserved. They designed supply chains to deliver repair parts and extend vehicle service life. Both approaches were rational given their respective circumstances. But in a long war of attrition, the American approach was decisive. German tactical victories that destroyed American equipment were ultimately meaningless because American losses were replaced faster than they could be inflicted. American tactical defeats that cost Germany equipment were devastating because German losses were permanent. The psychological impact on German soldiers who encountered American abundance was profound. Letters and diaries from German prisoners of war, collected and analyzed by American intelligence services, revealed consistent themes. German soldiers expressed shock at American wastefulness. They watched Americans discard equipment that Germans would have carefully preserved, worn boots replaced instead of repaired, damaged tools thrown away instead of fixed, vehicles with minor problems abandoned by the roadside. For soldiers who had spent years fighting with inadequate supplies, wearing worn uniforms, using weapons that should have been replaced years earlier, and making do with whatever materials they could scavenge, the American abundance was incomprehensible. It suggested a nation with resources so vast that waste was acceptable. More disturbing, it suggested a nation that could afford to lose equipment and men at rates that would cripple Germany and still continue attacking with undiminished strength. The Jeep became the symbol of this disparity. It was not the most powerful American weapon. The Sherman tank, the P-51 Mustang fighter, the B-17 bomber, all these were more lethal. But the Jeep was the most visible. It was everywhere. German soldiers saw Jeeps at the front lines, in the rear areas, on roads, in fields, in forests. The presence of Jeeps meant American logistics were functioning. Where there were Jeeps, there was fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything an army needed to sustain combat operations indefinitely. German tactical planning in Western Europe after D-Day increasingly revolved around the reality of American mobility. Attacking American positions meant facing forces that could relocate faster than German units could encircle them. Cutting American supply lines achieved little because American logistics had so much redundancy that losing a few vehicles made no practical difference. Defending static positions was futile because American forces could concentrate overwhelming firepower, reduce the position to rubble, and move on before German reinforcements arrived. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Lehr Division, wrote extensive accounts of fighting American forces in France for the United States Army Historical Division after the war. His manuscripts, totaling hundreds of pages, described how American units at every level possessed organic transportation that allowed them to respond to changing situations in minutes rather than hours. German units, even elite panzer divisions, could not match this flexibility because their logistics trains were too cumbersome and their light vehicles too few and too fragile. Bayerlein's assessment was consistent with other German commanders. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, interrogated after his capture, stated that Germany's defeat was primarily the result of Allied material superiority. When asked specifically about American equipment that impressed him, Jodl mentioned the Jeep before mentioning any American weapon system. The irony was not lost on the German officers. In 1939, they had dismissed the Jeep as an American toy, an example of typical American excess and engineering naivety. By 1945, they recognized it as one of the most effective pieces of military equipment deployed in the war. The vehicle they had mocked had become the vehicle they coveted above all others. After the war, the Jeep's influence on military vehicle design was immediate and lasting. The Soviet Union had received thousands of Jeeps through Lend-Lease during the war. Soviet engineers studied these vehicles extensively. Even before significant Lend-Lease deliveries arrived, Soviet designers had begun work on their own light vehicle based on newspaper photographs of American prototypes. The result was the GAZ-64, which entered production in March of 1941. This was later developed into the GAZ-67, incorporating design improvements learned from studying Lend-Lease Jeeps. The GAZ-67 served throughout the Cold War. It was not a direct copy of the Jeep, but it embodied the same philosophy: four-wheel drive, simple construction, adequate power, designed for mass production. The Soviet Union, like America, was a continental power with vast resources. Soviet military planners drew the same conclusion American planners had drawn. A versatile light vehicle available in enormous quantities was more valuable than specialized vehicles available in limited numbers. France developed the Delahaye VLR immediately after the war. The design was clearly influenced by the Jeep, though it used different mechanical components. Italy produced the Fiat Campagnola, another Jeep-inspired vehicle. Great Britain, which had relied heavily on American Jeeps during the war, developed the Land Rover as a civilian vehicle, but with obvious design influence from the Jeep. Japan, occupied by American forces after 1945, encountered Jeeps in large numbers. Japanese engineers studied the vehicles. Toyota developed the Land Cruiser as a response to Jeep design principles. Nissan developed the Patrol for similar reasons. Both vehicles became successful commercial products, demonstrating that the Jeep concept had applications beyond military use. Even Germany, when the Federal Republic began rebuilding its military in the 1950s under NATO, designed its light tactical vehicles with clear influence from Jeep principles. The early Bundeswehr used surplus American Jeeps initially. When German industry began producing domestic military vehicles, they incorporated four-wheel drive, simple, robust construction, and versatility that reflected lessons learned from encountering Jeeps during the war. The United States Army continued using Jeeps in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The basic design evolved through successive models. The M38 replaced the wartime MB. The M38A1 introduced refinements. The M151 MUTT, introduced in 1960, represented a more significant redesign, but retained the fundamental concept: lightweight, four-wheel drive, versatile utility vehicle. The Jeep's direct descendants served in the American military until the 1980s, when the HMMWV, the Humvee, finally replaced them. The civilian market for Jeeps was equally significant. Willys began producing civilian versions in 1945. The CJ-2A, for civilian Jeep Model 2A, was essentially a military Jeep without blackout lights, Pioneer tools, and military markings. It found immediate acceptance among farmers, ranchers, construction, workers, oil field workers, and anyone who needed a vehicle that could operate in difficult terrain. The design became an American icon. Through multiple corporate owners and decades of evolution, the basic Jeep concept persisted into the 21st century. Otto Skorzeny, the commando who had attempted to use captured Jeeps in Operation Greif, survived the war. He was tried for war crimes related to the operation, specifically the improper use of enemy uniforms in violation of the Hague Convention. His defense argued that wearing enemy uniforms for deception was legal as long as the uniforms were removed before engaging in combat. The tribunal, influenced by testimony from British Special Operations, executive officers who admitted to similar practices, acquitted Skorzeny in September of 1947. Skorzeny escaped from an internment camp in July of 1948 with assistance from former SS officers. He eventually settled in Spain under Franco's protection. He occasionally gave interviews about his wartime experiences. When asked about Operation Greif, he consistently stated that the operation was doomed from the start, not because of flaws in planning or execution, but because Germany simply did not have the material resources to compete with American logistics. He specifically cited the shortage of captured Jeeps as evidence of the broader problem. The Americans had so many that capturing them should have been easy. Yet even systematic efforts over 18 months yielded fewer than 200 operational vehicles. Fritz Bayerlein survived the war and contributed extensively to the United States Army's historical program. Between 1945 and 1954, he authored approximately 20 detailed manuscripts about Wehrmacht operations in Normandy, the Ardennes, and other campaigns. His accounts consistently emphasized the impact of American material superiority, particularly mobility and logistics. Bayerlein died in Germany in 1970. Ferdinand Porsche, whose engineers had dismissed the Jeep as a joke in 1939, was arrested by American forces in May of 1945. He was interrogated about his role in military vehicle development and his use of forced labor. He spent nearly 2 years in detention before being released in August of 1947. He died in January of 1952. His company, reorganized after the war, went on to produce some of the world's most sophisticated sports cars, vehicles that prioritized engineering excellence and performance, the same values that had guided German military vehicle design during the war. The final production statistics tell the story with arithmetic clarity. 641,854 Jeeps were produced between 1941 and 1945. Germany produced 50,435 Kubelwagens during the entire war. The ratio was nearly 13-1. If every German light vehicle produced during the war, including motorcycles, had been a Kubelwagen, the ratio would still have been more than 4-1 in America's favor. But the numbers alone do not capture the full significance. The Jeep represented a revolution in military thinking. It demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly organized and applied, could create advantages that tactical brilliance could not overcome. It proved that versatility and abundance could defeat specialization and efficiency. It showed that in modern industrial warfare, the nation that could build more equipment faster and keep it running under any conditions would win, regardless of individual technical superiority. The German engineers who had laughed at the Jeep specifications in 1939 were not stupid. They were intelligent, skilled professionals, making rational assessments based on their understanding of military requirements and industrial capabilities. Their mistake was assuming that warfare in the 1940s would be governed by the same principles that had governed warfare in the 19th century. Efficiency, quality, tactical excellence. These had been decisive for generations of German military success. But the nature of warfare had changed. The internal combustion engine, combined with radio communication and industrial mass production, had created a new kind of conflict. Wars were no longer won primarily by better soldiers or better generals. They were won by better logistics, built on industrial foundations that could sustain combat operations at intensities and durations that previous generations would have considered impossible. The Jeep was not a perfect vehicle. It had flaws. The ride was rough. The canvas top provided minimal protection from weather. The heater was inadequate in cold climates. The brakes were marginal when the vehicle was heavily loaded. German criticisms of these shortcomings were valid, but these flaws were irrelevant compared to the vehicle's fundamental capability and availability. That is how the Jeep became the most admired piece of American equipment among German soldiers, not through firepower or technological innovation, but through reliable utility available in unlimited quantities. It was everywhere. It worked. And there was always another one. The vehicle itself was unremarkable in many ways, but what it represented was revolutionary. An army that could afford to treat a sophisticated mechanical vehicle as a disposable commodity, industrial capacity so vast that individual losses were statistically invisible, logistics so abundant that waste was acceptable because shortage was impossible. That was the force that defeated Germany. Not better soldiers or better generals, though American forces developed both as the war progressed, but better logistics. Built on an industrial foundation that could produce 641,854 identical vehicles in 4 years, while simultaneously building tanks, aircraft, ships, and everything else an army needed to fight a global war on multiple continents against multiple enemies simultaneously. The German engineers who dismissed the Jeep in 1939 learned their mistake by 1943. But by then, it was too late. The industrial machine that produced those 640,000 Jeeps was already operating at full capacity. And nothing Germany could do, no tactical brilliance, no strategic innovation, no wonder weapons, could stop it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.